I gotta hit that button. There. Ta-da! Hi, folks. This has been I think this is day 6 of I'm still being a bachelor. It's just you and me and whoever else shows up. Hang on. With apologies, of course. I've got a coffee. It's nice. I chose to sleep in this morning. I'm actually this afternoon now, isn't it? Oh, what was that? It's really hard to maintain a train of thought. You know, I talk for a living, and I'm still like, oh, what am I doing? Anyway, let me tell you. I got really tired of Panache. I got really, really tired of Panache. Like, the last time I was reading it, like, just last week, we got partway through, and I was really kind of struggling with nobody being present. And, well, not quite nobody, but, you know. I sort of craved a little bit of interaction, and it wasn't happening, and I was really hating what I was reading, and so I just went, that's it, I'm out of here. It was Panache. Panache really did it for me. Apparently near the end of book 4, Panache shits himself, which I guess would be kind of a comeuppance, because he's made other people shit themselves. Conskype themselves? Anyway, enough about that. I want to tell you about this thing. The Surprising Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which I'm told is a bunch of much more entertaining tall tales. Was originally, I think, written in English. Maybe it was. Whatever. Blah, blah, blah. Let's get to it. If there's Panache, though, I'm going to be so furious. And it's published in 1895, so the language ought to be a little bit more modern. And also, I don't really feel like reading about the history of the book, so let's get through that. Okay. Preface to the first edition. Baron Munchausen or Munchausen of Bodenweider, near Hamlin on the Weser, belongs to the noble family of that name, which gave to the king's German dominions the late prime minister and several other public characters equally bright and illustrious. He is a man of great original humor, and having found that prejudiced minds cannot be reasoned into common sense, and that bold assertors are very aptly to bully and speak their audience out of it, he never argues with either of them, but adroitly turns the conversations upon indifferent topics, and then tells the story of his travels, campaigns, and sporting adventures, in a manner peculiar to himself, and well calculated to awaken and shame the common sense of those who have lost sight of it by prejudice or habit. As this method has been often attended with good success, we beg leave to lay some of his stories before the public, and humbly request those who shall find them rather extravagant and bordering upon the marvelous, which will require but a very moderate share of common sense, to exercise the very same upon every occurrence of life, and chiefly upon our English politics, in which old habits and bold assertions, set off by eloquent speeches and supported by constitutional mobs. Oh, hang on. Oh, right, it's over there. Hi, Montreth. No, I just started. So, you are, in fact, very much on time. I was looking over the other monitor to see if people were showing up, so then I remembered you're here now, on this screen. So, no, fantastic. Okay. Old habits and bold assertions, set off by eloquent speeches and supported by constitutional mobs, associations, volunteers, and foreign influence, have of late, we apprehend, but too successfully turned our brains and made us the laughing stock of Europe and of France and Holland in particular. Well, I hope it's an ideal time for you, because I appreciate you being here, and F those that aren't. To the public. Having heard for the first time that my adventures have been doubted and looked upon as jokes, I feel bound to come forward and vindicate my character for veracity by paying 3 shillings at the mansion house of this great city for the affidavits hereto appended. This I have been forced into in regard of my own honor, although I have retired for many years from public and private life, and I hope that this, my last edition, will place me in a proper light with my readers. At the city of London, England. We, the undersigned, as true believers in the Prophet, do most solemnly affirm that all the adventures of our friend Baron Munchausen, in whatever country they may lie, are positive and simple facts, and, as we have been believed, whose adventures are tenfold more wonderful. So do we hope all true believers will give him their full faith and credence. Gulliver, Sinbad, Aladdin, sworn at the Mansion House 9th November last in the absence of the Lord Mayor John, the porter. This is well. Now, finally, the travelers of Baron Munchausen. Yeah, of course. I mean, he's the most... Yeah, people have offended the Baron's honor by saying that he's lying. And, well, why don't I read one of these stories, and you can see for yourself as to whether he's being honest or not. I think this is reasonable. The Baron is supposed to relate these adventures to his friends over a bottle. The Baron relates an account of his first travels, the astonishing effects of a storm, arrives at Ceylon, combats and conquers 2 extraordinary opponents, and returns to Holland. Some years before my beard announced approaching manhood, or in other words, when I was neither man nor boy, but between both, I expressed in repeated conversations a strong desire of seeing the world, from which I was discouraged by my parents. Although my father had been no inconsiderable traveler himself, as will appear before I have reached the end of my singular, and, I may add, interesting adventures. A cousin, by my mother's side, took a liking to me, often said I was a fine, forward youth, and was much inclined to gratify my curiosity. His eloquence had more effect than mine, for my father consented to my accompanying him in a voyage to the island of Ceylon, where his uncle had resided as governor many years. We sailed from Amsterdam with dispatches from their high mightiness the states of Holland. The only circumstance which happened on our voyage worth relating was the wonderful effect of a storm, which had torn up by the roots a great number of trees of enormous bulk and height, in an island where we lay at anchor to take in water or wood and water. Some of these trees weighed many tons, yet they were carried by the wind so amazingly high that they appeared like feathers of small birds floating in the air, for they were at least 5 miles above the earth. However, as soon as the storm subsided, they all fell perpendicularly into their respective places and took root again, excepting the largest, which happened, when it was blown into the air, to have a man and his wife, a very honest old couple, upon its branches, gathering cucumbers. In this part of the globe, that useful vegetable grows upon trees. The weight of this couple, as the tree descended, overbalanced the trunk and brought it down in a horizontal position. It fell upon the chief man of the island and killed him on the spot. He had quitted his house in the storm, under an apprehension of its falling upon him, and was returning through his own garden when this fortunate accident happened. The word fortunate here requires some explanation. I don't know. I would try these tree cucumbers. I'm kind of interested. So the word fortunate here requires some explanation. This chief was a man of a very avaricious and oppressive disposition, and though he had no family, the natives of the island were half starved by his oppressive and infamous impositions. The very goods which he had thus taken from them were spoiling in his stores, while the poor wretches from whom they were plundered were pining in poverty. Though the destruction of this tyrant was accidental, the people chose the cucumber gatherers for their governors as a mark of their gratitude for destroying, though accidentally, their late tyrant. After we had repaired the damages we sustained in this remarkable storm, and taken leave of the new governor and his lady, we sailed with a fair wind for the object of our voyage. In about 6 weeks we arrived at Ceylon, where we were received with great marks of friendship and true politeness. The following singular adventures may not prove unentertaining. After we had resided at Ceylon for about a fortnight, I accompanied one of the governor's brothers upon a shooting party. He was a strong, athletic man, and being used to that climate, for he had resided there for some years, he bore the violent heat of the sun much better than I could. In our excursion he had made a considerable progress through a thick wood, when I was only at the entrance. Near the banks of a large piece of water, which had engaged my attention, I thought I heard a rustling noise behind. On turning about, I was almost petrified, as who would not be, at the sight of a lion, which was evidently approaching with the intention of satisfying his appetite with my poor carcass, and that without asking my consent. What was to be done in this horrible dilemma? I had not even a moment for reflection. My piece was only charged with swan shot, and I had... yeah, oh, yeah, of course! Ceylon's full of lions. This guy's not lying. My piece was only charged with swan shot, and I had no other about me. However, though I could have no idea of killing such an animal with that weak kind of ammunition, yet I had some hopes of frightening him by the report, and perhaps of wounding him also. I immediately let fly, without waiting till he was within reach, and if the report did but enrage him, for now he quickened his pace, and seemed to approach me full speed. I attempted to escape, but that only added, if an addition could be made, to my distress, for the moment I turned about I found a large crocodile, and with his mouth extended almost ready to receive me. On my right hand was the piece of water before mentioned, and on my left a deep precipice, said to have, as I have since learned, a receptacle at the bottom for venomous creatures. In short, I gave myself up as lost, for the lion was now upon his hind legs, just in the act of seizing me. I fell involuntarily to the ground with fear, and as it afterwards appeared, he sprang over me. I lay some time in a situation which no language can describe, expecting to feel his teeth or talons in some part of me every moment. After waiting in this prostrate situation a few seconds, I heard a violent but unusual noise, different from any sound that had ever before assailed my ears. Nor is it at all to be wondered at, when I inform you from whence it proceeded. After listening for some time, I ventured to raise my head and look round, when to my unspeakable joy I perceived the lion had, by the eagerness with which he had sprung at me, jumped forward as I fell into the crocodile's mouth, which, as before observed, was wide open, the head of the one stuck in the throat of the other, and they were struggling to extricate themselves. I fortunately recollected my couteau de chasse, which was by my side. With this instrument I severed the lion's head at one blow, and the body fell off at my feet. I then, with the butt end of my fowling piece, rammed the head farther into the throat of the crocodile, and destroyed him by suffocation, for he could neither gorge nor eject it. Soon after I had thus gained a complete victory over my two powerful adversaries, my companion arrived in search for me, for finding I did not follow him into the wood, he returned, apprehending I had lost my way, or met with some accident. After mutual congratulations, we measured the crocodile, which was just 40 feet in length. You know, a small guy, I'm sure. As soon as we had related this extraordinary adventure to the governor, he sent a wagon and servants, who brought home the two carcasses. The lion's skin was properly preserved, with its hair on, after which it was made into tobacco pouches, and presented by me, upon our return to Holland, to the burgomasters, who, in return, requested my acceptance of 1,000 ducats. The skin of the crocodile was stuffed in the usual manner, and makes a capital article in their public museum at Amsterdam, where the exhibitor relates the whole story to each spectator, with such additions as he thinks proper. Some of his variations are rather extravagant. One of them is the lion jumped quite through the crocodile, and was making his escape at the back door when, as soon as his head appeared, Monsieur the Great Baron, as he is pleased to call me, cut it off, and 3 feet of the crocodile's tail along with it. Nay, so little attention had this fellow to the truth, that he sometimes adds, as soon as the crocodile missed his tail, he turned around, snatched the couteau de chasse out of Monsieur's hand, and swallowed it with such an eagerness that it pierced his heart and killed him immediately. The little regard which this impudent knave has to veracity makes me sometimes apprehensive that my real facts may fall under suspicion, by being found in company with his confounded inventions. I don't know, that's like a 13-meter-long crocodile. He's kind of somewhat sizable, maybe. Or a tiny little boy. Actually, I suspect they're not normal. I'm trying to actually imagine 13 meters, and I guess that would kind of make him okay size. No, he's really big. But yeah, right? Who? I'm apoplectic. Who would lie about such things? Oh. The missus is still out west right now, which is why she's not here today, which is really unfortunate. But fortunately, this is being recorded, and we'll post it on YouTube later. Let me tell you about Chapter 2, which is sure to be filled with only the truth and facts, and yeah, in which the Baron proves himself a good shot. He loses his horse and finds a wolf, makes him draw his sledge, promises to entertain his company with a relation of such facts as are well deserving their notice. Yeah, the thing is that I don't know how I found this story. I was blundering some years ago for things to read, for other purposes, and I stumbled across a story about a man who defeats a bear using only 2 flints. And I thought, for sure this isn't, and I don't know, in my mind it was conflated with Rabelais. So I was really looking forward to finding it, only to find out that it wasn't in the book that I was struggling to get through anyway. It's in this one. I set off from Rome on a journey to Russia in the midst of winter, from a just notion that frost and snow must of course mend the roads, which every traveler had described as uncommonly bad through the northern parts of Germany, Poland, Courland, and Livonia. Excuse me. I went on horseback, as the most convenient manner of traveling. I was but lightly clothed, and of this I felt the inconvenience the more I advanced northeast. What must not a poor old man have suffered in that severe weather and climate, whom I saw on a bleak common in Poland, lying on the road, helpless, shivering, and hardly having wherewithal to cover his nakedness? I pitied the poor soul, though I felt the severity of the air myself. I threw my mantle over him, and immediately I heard a voice from the heavens, blessing me for that piece of charity, saying, "You will be rewarded, my son, for this in time." Considering this was written after Napoleon's little adventure in Russia, you'd figure people would have sort of taken it to heart. Who knows? I went on. Night and darkness overtook me. No village was to be seen. The country was covered with snow, and I was unacquainted with the road. Tired, I alighted and fastened my horse to something like the pointed stump of a tree, which appeared above the snow. For the sake of safety, I placed my pistols under my arm and laid down on the snow, where I slept so soundly that I did not open my eyes till full daylight. It is not easy to conceive my astonishment to find myself in the midst of a village, lying in a churchyard, nor was my horse to be seen. But I heard him soon after neigh somewhere above me. On looking upwards, I beheld him hanging by his bridle to the weathercock of the steeple. Matters were now very plain to me. The village had been covered with snow overnight. A sudden change of weather had taken place. I had sunk down to the courtyard whilst asleep, gently, and in the same proportion as the snow had melted away. And what in the dark I had taken to be a stump of a little tree, appearing above the snow, to which I had tied my horse, proved to have been the cross or weathercock of the steeple. Without long consideration, I took one of my pistols, shot the bridle in two, brought the horse, and proceeded on my journey. Here the Baron seems to have forgot his feelings. He should certainly have ordered his horse a feed of corn after fasting so long. He carried me well, advancing into the interior parts of Russia. I found traveling on horseback rather unfashionable in winter, therefore I submitted, as I always do, to the custom of the country, took a single horse sledge, and drove briskly towards St. Petersburg. I do not exactly recall whether it was in Eastland or Jugmanland, or Jugamanland, Jugaman. But I remember that in the midst of a dreary forest, I spied a terrible wolf making after me. With all the speed of ravenous winter hunger. He soon overtook me. There was no possibility of escape. Mechanically, I laid myself down flat in the sledge and let my horse run for our safety. What I wished, but hardly hoped or expected, happened immediately after. The wolf did not mind me in the least, but took a leap over me, and falling furiously on the horse, began instantly to tear and devour the hind part of the poor animal. Only one wolf, which ran the faster for his pain and terror. Thus unnoticed and safe myself, I lifted my head slightly up, and with horror I beheld that the wolf had ate his way into the horse's body. It was not long before he had fairly forced himself into it, when I took my advantage and fell upon him with the butt end of my whip. Whoopsh! This unexpected attack in his rear frightened him so much that he leaped forward with all his might. The horse's carcass dropped on the ground, but in his place the wolf was in the harness, and I on my part whipping him continually. We both arrived in full career safe at St. Petersburg, contrary to our respective expectations, and very much to the astonishment of the spectators. I shall not tire you, gentlemen and gentlewomen, with the politics, arts, sciences, and history of this magnificent metropolis of Russia, nor trouble you with the various intrigues and pleasant adventures I had in the politer circles of that country, where the lady of the house always receives a visitor with a dram and a salute. I shall confine myself rather to the greater and nobler objects of your attention, horses and dogs, my favorites in the brute creation, also to foxes, wolves, and bears, with which, and game in general, Russia abounds more than any other part of the world, and to such sports, manly exercises, and feats of gallantry and activity, as show the gentleman better than musty Greek or Latin, or all the perfume, finery, and capers of French wits or petit maître. Yeah, who cares about culture? Let's talk animals. Let's talk hunting. Chapter 3. An encounter between the Baron's nose and a doorpost, with its wonderful effects. 50 brace of ducks and other fowl destroyed by one shot, flogs a fox out of his skin, leads an old sow home in a new way, and vanquishes a wild boar. It was some time before I could obtain a commission in the army, and for several months I was perfectly at liberty to sport away my time and money in the most gentlemanlike manner. You may easily imagine that I spent much of both out of town, with such gallant fellows as knew how to make the most of an open forest country. The very recollection of those amusements gives me fresh spirits, and creates a warm wish for a repetition of them. One morning I saw, through the windows of my bedroom, that a large pond not far off was covered with wild ducks. What should any reasonable gentleman think? Let's kill them all! In an instant, I took my gun from the corner, ran downstairs, and out of the house in such a hurry that I imprudently struck my face against the doorpost. Fire flew out of my eyes, but it did not prevent my intention. I soon came within shot, when, leveling my piece, I observed to my sorrow that even the flint had sprung from the cock by the violence of the shock I had just received. There was no time to be lost. I presently remembered the effect it had on my eyes, therefore opened the pan, leveled my piece against the wild fowls, and my fist against one of my eyes. Yeah. That's exactly my reaction, Montreth. And my fist against one of my eyes. The Baron's eyes have since retained fire ever since, and appear particularly illuminated when he relates this anecdote. A hearty blow drew sparks again. The shot went off, and I killed 50 brace of ducks, 20 widgeons, and 3 couple of teals. Presence of mind is the soul of manly exercises. If soldiers and sailors owe it to many of their lucky escapes, hunters and sportsmen are not less beholden to it for many of their successes. In a noble forest in Russia, I met a fine black fox, whose valuable skin it would have been a pity to tear by ball or shot. A renard stood close to a tree. In a twinkling, I took out my ball and placed a good spike nail in its room, fired, and hit him so cleverly that I nailed his brush fast to the tree. I now went up to him, took out my hanger, and gave him a cross cut over the face, laid hold of my whip, and fairly flogged him out of his fine skin. Chance and good luck often correct our mistakes. Of this I had a singular instance soon after, when, in the depth of a forest, I saw a wild pig and sow running close behind each other. My ball had missed them, yet the foremost pig only ran away, and the sow stood motionless, as fixed to the ground. On examining into the matter, I found the latter one to be an old sow, blind with age, which had taken hold of her pig's tail, in order to be led along by filial duty. My ball, having passed between the two, had cut his leading string, which the old sow continued to hold in her mouth. And as her former guide did not draw her on any longer, she had stopped, of course. I therefore laid hold of the remaining end of the pig's tail, and led the old beast home without any further trouble on my part, and without any reluctance or apprehension on the part of the helpless old animal. Ah, well, that's kind of out of sorts with the guy who just basically flogged a fox out of his own skin. Terrible as these wild sows are, yet more fierce and dangerous are the boars, one of which I had the misfortune to meet in a forest, unprepared for attack or defense. I retired behind an oak tree, just when the furious animal leveled a side blow at me, with such force that his tusks pierced through the tree, by which means he could neither repeat the blow nor retire. Ho, ho, thought I shall soon have you now, and immediately I laid hold of a stone, wherewith I hammered and bent his tusks in such a manner that he could not retreat by any means, and must wait my return from the next village, whither I went for ropes and a cart to secure him properly, and to carry him off safe and alive, in which I perfectly succeeded. Wow, this one's not going to take too long. Look at the progress we're making. We're sort of like a 20% throw. Chapter 4. Reflections on St. Hubert Stag. Shoots a stag with cherry stones. The wonderful effects of it. Kills a bear by extraordinary dexterity. His danger pathetically described. Attacked by a wolf, which he turns inside out. Is assailed by a mad dog, from which he escapes. The baron's cloak seized with madness, by which his whole wardrobe is thrown into confusion. You have heard, I dare say, of the hunter and sportsman's saint and protector, Saint Hubert. Maybe Saint Hubert, who knows? And of the noble stag, which appeared to him in the forest with the holy cross between his antlers. I have paid my homage to that saint every year in good fellowship, and seen this stag 1,000 times, either painted in churches or embroidered in the star of his knights. So that, upon the honor and conscience of a good sportsman, I hardly knew whether there may not have been formerly, or whether there were not such crossed stags even at this present day. But let me rather tell what I have seen myself. Having one day spent all my shot, I found myself unexpected. I really should have closed more tasks, so more fool me, huh? Yeah, it's great. Okay, having one day spent all my shot, I found myself unexpectedly in the presence of a stately stag, looking at me as unconcernedly as if he had known of my empty pouches. I charged immediately with powder, and upon it a good handful of cherry stones, for which I had sucked the fruit as far as the hurry would permit. Thus I let fly at him, and hit him just on the middle of the forehead, between his antlers. It stunned him, he staggered, yet he made off. A year or two after, being with a party in the same forest, I beheld a noble stag with a fine, full-grown cherry tree above 10 feet high between his antlers. I immediately recollected my former adventure, looked upon him as my property, and brought him to the ground by one shot, which at once gave me the haunch and cherry sauce, for the tree was covered with the richest fruit, the like I had never tasted before. Who knows, but some passionate holy sportsman or sporting abbot or bishop may have shot, planted, and fixed the cross between the antlers of St. Hubert Stag in a manner similar to this. They always have been, and still are, famous for plantations of crosses and antlers, and in a case of distress or dilemma, which too often happens to keen sportsmen, One is apt to grasp at anything for safety, and to try any expedient rather than miss the favorable opportunity. I have many times found myself in that trying situation. What do you say of this, for example? Daylight and powder were spent one day in a Polish forest. When I was going home, a terrible bear made up to me in a great speed, with mouth open, ready to fall upon me. All my pockets were searched in an instant for powder and ball, but in vain. I found nothing but 2 spare flints. One I flung with all my might into the monster's open jaws, down his throat. It gave him pain and made him turn about, so that I could level the second at his back door, which indeed I did with wonderful success, for it flew in, met the first flint in the stomach, struck fire, and blew up the bear with a terrible explosion. Though it came off safe in that time, yet I should not wish to try it again, or venture against bears with no other ammunition. There is a kind of fatality in it. The fiercest and most dangerous animals generally came upon me when defenseless, as if they had a notion or an instinctive intimation of it. Thus, a frightful wolf rushed upon me so suddenly and so close that I could do nothing but follow mechanical instinct and thrust my fist into his open mouth. For safety's sake, I pushed on, till my arm was fairly up into the shoulder. How should I disengage myself? I was not much pleased with my awkward situation. With a wolf face to face, our ogling was not of the most pleasant kind. If I withdrew my arm, then the animal would fly the more furiously upon me. That I saw in his flaming eyes. In short, I laid hold of his tail, turned him inside out like a glove, and flung him to the ground, where I left him. Ugh, that just seems unusually juicy. That wolf had timed it well, though. That same expedient would not have answered against a mad dog, which soon after came running against me in a narrow street at St. Petersburg. Run who can, I thought, and to do this the better, I threw off my fur cloak and was safe within doors in an instant. I sent my servant for the cloak, because I am a very brave man. That was my aside. And he put it in the wardrobe with my other clothes. The day after, I was amazed and frightened by Jack's bawling, "For God's sake, sir, your fur cloak is mad!" I hastened up to him and found almost all my clothes tossed about and torn to pieces. The fellow was perfectly right in his apprehensions about the fur cloak's madness. I saw him myself just then falling upon a fine full-dress suit which he shook and tossed in an unmerciful manner. So, like, did he confuse the dog for the cloak? I don't even... Anyway. Or did the cloak just simply go mad? The cloak was just avenging all the other animals. The effects of great activity and presence of mind. A favorite hound described, which pups while pursuing a hare. The hare also litters while pursued by the hound. Presented with a famous horse by Count Przobosky. It's probably Brodkowski or something, with which he performs many extraordinary feats. I apologize to Polish speakers everywhere that I mangled that name. All these narrow and lucky escapes, gentlemen. Also, I'm inclined to agree with you. Those servants, ho ho ho. They can't tell the difference between a dog and a cloak. Ho ho ho. Ah, merry jape. All these narrow and lucky escapes, gentlemen, were chances turned to advantage by presence of mind and vigorous exertions, which, taken together, as everybody knows, make the fortunate sportsman, sailor, and soldier. But he would be a very blamable and imprudent sportsman, admiral, or general, who would always depend upon chance and his stars, without troubling himself about those arts which are their particular pursuits, and without providing the very best implements which ensure success. I was not blamable either way, for I have always been as remarkable for the excellency of my horses, dogs, guns, and swords, as for the proper manner of using and managing them, so that, upon the whole, I may hope to be remembered in the forest, upon the turf, and in the field. I shall not enter here into any detail of my stables, kennel, or armory, but a favorite bitch of mine I cannot help but mentioning to you. She was a greyhound, and I never had or saw a better. she grew old in my service, and was not remarkable for her size, but rather for her uncommon swiftness. I always coursed with her. Had you seen her, you must have admired her, and would not have wondered at my predilection and at my coursing her so much. She ran so fast, so much, and so long on my service, that she actually ran off her legs, so that in the latter part of her life I was under the necessity of working and using her only as a terrier, in which quality she still served me many years. Coursing one day a hare, which appeared to me uncommonly big, I pitied my poor bitch, being big with pups, yet she would course as fast as ever. I could follow her on horseback only at a great distance. Yeah, that overall, this is sort of taken a weird turn. I was kind of, yeah. I mean, I'm just sort of reacting to what you're saying there. I'm like, yeah, you're right. I could only follow her on horseback only at a great distance. At once I heard a cry as if it were a pack of hounds, but so weak and faint that I hardly knew what to make of it. Coming up to them, I was greatly surprised. The hare had littered in running. The same had happened to my bitch in coursing, and there were just as many leverets as pups. By instinct the former ran, the latter coursed. And thus I found myself in a possession at once of 6 hares and as many dogs, at the end of a course which had only begun with 1. I remember this, my wonderful bitch, with the same pleasure and tenderness as a superb Lithuanian horse, which no money could have bought. Oh, so I have to apologize to Lithuanians rather than Poles. He became mine by an accident, which gave me an opportunity of showing my horsemanship to a great advantage. I was at Count Przbalski's noble country seat in Lithuania, and remained with the ladies at tea in the drawing-room, while the gentlemen were down in the yard to see a young horse of blood which had just arrived from the stud. We suddenly heard a noise of distress. I hastened downstairs, and found the horse so unruly that nobody durst approach or mount him. The most resolute horseman stood dismayed and aghast. Despondency was expressed in every countenance, when in one leap I was on his back, and took him by surprise, and worked him quite into gentleness and obedience with the best display of horsemanship I was master of. Fully to show this to the ladies, and save them unnecessary trouble, I forced him to leap in at one of the open windows of the tea-room, walked around several times, paced, trot, and gallop, and then at last made him mount the tea-table, there to repeat his lessons in a pretty style of miniature, which was exceedingly pleasing to the ladies, for he performed them amazingly well, and did not break either cup or saucer. It placed me so high in their opinion, and so well in that of the noble lord, that, with his usual politeness, he begged I would accept of this young horse, and ride him full career to conquest and honor in the campaign against the Turks, which was soon to be opened under the command of Count Munich. Well, yeah, because imagine the stories he was telling the ladies. 7 with 1 blow, if you know what I mean. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I could not have received a more agreeable present, nor a more ominous one at the opening of that campaign in which I made my apprenticeship as a soldier. A horse so gentle, so spirited, and so fierce, at once a lamb and a Bucephalus, put me always in mind of the soldiers and gentlemen's duty of young Alexander, and of the astonishing things he performed in the field. We took the field, among several other reasons, it seems, with an intention to retrieve the character of the Russian arms, which had been blemished a little by Tsar Peter's last campaign on the Pruth. And this we fully accomplished by several very fatiguing and glorious campaigns under the command of that great general I mentioned before. Modesty forbids individuals to arrogate to themselves great success or victories, the glory of which is generally engrossed by the commander, nay, which is rather awkward, by kings and queens who never smelt gunpowder, but at the field days and reviews of their troops never saw a field of battle, nor an enemy in battle array. Nor do I claim any particular share of glory in the great engagements with the enemy. We all did our duty. which in the patriots, soldiers, and gentlemen's language is a very comprehensive word, of great honor, meaning, and import, and of which the generality of idle quidnuncs and coffee-house politicians can hardly form any but a very mean and contemptible idea. However, having had the command of a body of hussars, I went upon several expeditions with discretionary powers, and the success I then met with is, I think, fairly and only to be placed to my account, and to that of the brave fellows whom I led on to conquest and to victory. We had a very hot work once in the van of the army, when we drove the Turks into Oksakau. My spirited Lithuanian... Whoa. Somebody's having a normal outside. My spirited Lithuanian had almost brought me into a scrape. I had advanced forepost and saw the enemy coming against me in a cloud of dust, which left me rather uncertain about their actual numbers and real intentions. I don't want to say I was the best at war, but I was pretty damn good at it. Some might say I was the best, but I want to be modest. To wrap myself up in a similar cloud was common prudence, but would not have much advanced my knowledge, or answered the end for which I had been sent out. Therefore I let my flankers on both wings spread to the right and left, and make what dust they could, and I myself led on straight upon the enemy, to have nearer sight of them. In this I was gratified, for they stood and fought, till, for fear of my flankers, and then began to move off rather disorderly. This was the moment to fall upon them with spirit. We broke them entirely, made a terrible havoc amongst them, and drove them not only back to a walled town in their rear, but even through it, contrary to our most sanguine expectations. The swiftness of my Lithuanian enabled me to be foremost in the pursuit, and seeing the enemy fairly flying through the opposite gate, I thought it would be prudent to stop in the marketplace, to order the men to rendezvous. I stopped, gentlemen, but judge of my astonishment when in this marketplace I saw not one of my hussars about me. Are they scouring the other streets, or what has become of them? They could not be far off, and must at all events soon join me. In that expectation, I walked my panting Lithuanian to a spring in this marketplace, and let him drink. He drank uncommonly, with an eagerness not to be satisfied, but natural enough, for when I looked around for my men, what should I see, gentlemen? The hind part of the poor creature. Croup and legs were missing, as if he had been cut in two, and the water ran out as it came in, without refreshing or doing him any good. How could it have happened was quite a mystery to me, till I returned with him to the town gates. There I saw that when I rushed in pell-mell with the flying enemy, they had dropped the portcullis, a heavy falling door with sharp spikes at the bottom, unperceived by me, which had totally cut off his hind part, that still lay quivering on the outside of the gate. It would have been an irreparable loss, had not our farrier contrived to bring both parts together while hot. He sewed them up with sprigs and young shoots of laurel that were at hand, the wound healed, and what could not have happened but to... The wound sealed, and what could not have happened but to so glorious a horse, the sprigs took root in his body, grew up, and formed a bower over me, so that afterwards I could go upon many other expeditions in the shade of my own and my horse's laurels. The funny thing about this story is that some people heard laurel, but other people heard Yanny. Well, okay. Slap my thigh. That wasn't funny. And that's what, a decade-old reference now? I just pulled a dad joke. If it matters, just as a... It's probably a weird thing, but I had heard that sample, and to me, and still, it sounded like Yorol to me. Actually, I'll write that out. Whoa, not that. I typed it wrong. Yorol. Oh, F the colon. My keyboard is terrible. Yeah, it sounded like a speech synth kind of thing. Like, maybe it was like primitive. It might have been like an early gen AI or something. I don't know what the origin of the sound is, but it didn't quite sound human. But it was Yorol to me. Without the colon. Colon P! Chapter 6. I'm afraid this thing's only going to be like a couple sessions long. I mean, well, maybe not afraid, but... The Baron is made a prisoner of war and sold for a slave. He keeps the Sultan's bees, which are attacked by 2 bears. Loses one of his bees, a silver hatchet, which he throws at the bears, rebounds and flies up to the moon. Brings it back by an ingenious invention, falls to the earth on his return, and helps himself out of a pit. Extricates himself from a carriage which meets his in a narrow road, and in a manner never before attempted nor practiced since. The wonderful effects of the frost upon his servant's French horn. Yeah, the bears were facing each other, and I don't know. Well, he's beaten one bear already. I was not always successful. I had the the coffee's kind of... I don't have my usual drink here, so... I was not always successful. I had the misfortune to be overpowered by numbers, to be made prisoner of war, and, which is worse, but always usual amongst the Turks, to be sold for a slave. The Baron was afterwards in great favour with the Grand Seigneur, as will appear hereafter. In that state of humiliation, my daily task was not very hard and laborious, but rather singular and irksome. It was to drive the Sultan's bees every morning to their pasture grounds, to attend them all the day long, and against night to drive them back to their hives. One evening I missed a bee, and soon observed that 2 bears had fallen upon her to tear her to pieces for the honey she carried. Those are either really big bees or really small bears. I had nothing like an offensive weapon in my hands but the silver hatchet, which is the badge of the Sultan's gardeners and farmers. I threw it at the robbers. I've not seen the movie Beekeeper, but maybe you can tell me about it. Where is it? I threw it at the robbers with an intention to frighten them away, and set the poor bee at liberty. But by an unlucky turn of my arm, it flew upwards, and continued rising till it reached the moon. How should I recover it? How fetch it down again? I recollected that turkey beans grow very quick, and run up to an astonishing height. I planted one immediately. It grew and actually... Hang on. At some point I need to make a proper recording booth. This is getting out of hand. Alright. I planted one immediately. It grew and actually fastened itself to one of the moon's horns. So there's a super secret group of assassins called the Beekeepers. Was it? Oh gosh. There's a couple directors and individuals of great notoriety that I do recognize. Is it somebody known for making bad movies? Okay, it had fastened itself to one of the moon's horns. I had no more to do now but to climb up it into the moon, where I safely arrived and had a troublesome piece of business before I could find my silver hatchet, in a place where everything has the brightness of silver. At last, however, I found it in a heap of chaff and chopped straw. I was now for returning, but alas! The heat of the sun had dried up my bean. It was totally useless for my descent. So I fell to work, and twisted me a rope of that chopped straw, as long and as well as I could make it. This I fastened to one of the moon's horns, and slid down to the end of it. Here I held myself fast with the left hand, and with the hatchet in my right, I cut the long, now useless end of the upper part, which, when being tied to the lower end, brought me a good deal lower. This repeated slicing and tying of the rope did not improve its quality, or bring me down to the Sultan's farm. I was 4 or 5 miles from the earth at least when it broke. I fell to the ground with such amazing violence that I found myself stunned and in a hole 9 fathoms deep at least, made by the weight of my body falling from so great a height. I recovered, but knew not how to get out again. However, I dug slopes or steps with my fingernails. The Baron's nails were then of 40 years' growth, and easily accomplished it. Well, this sounds like, I'm just going to make a note to myself to look that up in a little bit. I can become a bit more cultured. How exciting! Peace was soon concluded with the Turks, and gaining my liberty, I left St. Petersburg at the time of that singular revolution, when the Emperor in his cradle, his mother, the Duke of Brunswick, her father, Field Marshal Munich, and many others were sent to Siberia. The winter was then so uncommonly severe all over Europe that ever since the sun seems to be frostbitten. At my return to this place, I felt on the road greater inconveniences than those I had experienced on my setting out. I travelled post, and finding myself in a narrow lane, bid the postilion give a signal with his horn, so that other travellers might not meet us in the narrow passage. He blew with all his might, but his endeavours were in vain. He could not make the horn sound, which was unaccountable and rather unfortunate, for soon after we found ourselves in the presence of another coach coming the other way. There was no proceeding. However, I got out of my carriage, and being pretty strong, placed it, wheels and all, upon my head. I then jumped over a hedge about 9 feet high, which, considering the weight of the coach, was rather difficult, into a field, and came out again by another jump into the road beyond the other carriage. I then went back for the horses, and placing one upon my head and the other under my left arm, by the same means brought them to my coach, put to, and proceeded to an inn at the end of our stage. Yeah. Yeah, he literally punched a hole in the ground. I was kind of expecting a wow, kind of a coyote tumble. I'd sort of conflated the two, your secret line and the coyote line with the beekeepers for whatever reason. All right, and we blah, 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 proceeded to an inn at the end of our stage. I should have told you that the horse under my arm was very spirited, and not above 4 years old. In making my second spring over the hedge, he expressed great dislike to that violent kind of motion by kicking and snorting. However, I confined his hind legs by putting them into my coat pocket. After we arrived at the inn, my postilion and I refreshed ourselves. He hung his horn on a peg near the kitchen fire. I sat on the other side. Suddenly we heard a tarang, tarang, tang, tang. We looked around and now found the reason why the postilion had not been able to sound his horn. His tunes were frozen up in the horn, and came out now by thawing, plain enough, much to the credit of the driver, so that the honest fellow entertained us for some time with a variety of tunes, without putting his mouth to the horn. The King of Prussia's March, Over the Hill and Over the Dale, with many other favourite tunes. At length the thawing entertainment concluded, as I shall this short account of my Russian travels. Some travellers are apt to advance more than is perhaps strictly true. If any of the company entertain a doubt of my veracity, I shall only say to such, I pity their want of faith, and must request that they will take leave before I begin the second part of my adventures, which are as strictly founded in fact as those of I have already related. I have a mind where you write this great big long outraged thing, and then I spend the next 2 hours reading it, trying my best to get the appropriate amount of outrage. Let me tell you about chapter 7 in the meantime. Man, this is weirdly taking me back to when I read Dirty Dough for your benefit. Well, also, we had a couple of friends along as well, but man, Dirty Dough was an adventure, wasn't it? Yeah, and you should have no doubt. I have personally no doubt in my mind that the Baron Munchausen is a man of honor and truthfulness, and has been most honorably saying only the truth. Dirty Dough is definitely great too, but I don't know that I want to go back to it, frankly. I mean, I was able to bully through it thanks to you guys being there, and it was an awful lot of fun having y'all in the call and just reacting audibly. But whew, boy, that was an experience. That might be worth doing at some point. I'll have to think about that. Supposing we get more people showing up for story time, then this sort of thing could work better. But meanwhile, The Baron relates his adventures on a voyage to North America, which are well worth the reader's attention. Pranks of a whale. All those pranking whales. A seagull saves a sailor's life. The Baron's head is forced into his stomach. A dangerous leak stopped a posteriori. I embarked at Portsmouth in a first-rate English man-of-war of 100 guns and 1,400 men for North America. Nothing worth relating happened till we arrived within 300 leagues of the river St. Lawrence, when the ship struck with amazing force against, as we supposed, a rock. However, upon heaving the lead, we could find no bottom. Or was it the lead? Even with 300 fathom. What made this circumstance the most wonderful, and indeed beyond all comprehension, was that the violence of the shock was such that we lost our rudder, broke our bowsprit in the middle, and split all our masts from top to bottom, 2 of which went by the board. A poor fellow, who was aloft furling the mainsheet, was flung at least 3 leagues from the ship. But he fortunately saved his life by laying hold of the tail of a large seagull, who brought him back, and lodged him on the very spot from whence he was thrown. Another proof of the violence was the shock was the force with which some people between decks were driven against the floors above them. My head particularly was pressed into my stomach, where it continued some months before it recovered its natural situation. Whilst we were all in a state of astonishment at the general and unaccountable confusion in which we were involved, the whole was suddenly explained by the appearance of a large whale, who had been basking asleep within 16 feet of the surface of the water. This animal was so much displeased with the disturbance which our ship had given him, for in our passage we had with our rudder scratched his nose, that he beat in all the gallery and part of the quarter-deck with his tail, and almost at the same instant took the main-sheet anchor, which was suspended, as it usually is, from the head, between his teeth, and ran away with the ship at least 60 leagues, at the rate of 12 leagues an hour, when fortunately the cable broke, and we lost both the whale and the anchor. However, upon our return to Europe, some months after, we found the same whale within a few leagues of the same spot, floating dead upon the water. It measured above half a mile in length. As we could take but a small quantity of such a monstrous animal on board, we got our boats out, and with much difficulty cut off his head, where, to our great joy, we found the anchor and above 40 fathom of the cable, concealed on the left side of his mouth, just under his tongue. Perhaps this was the cause of his death, as that side of his tongue was much swelled, with a great degree of inflammation. This was the only extraordinary circumstance that happened on this voyage. One part of our distress, however, I had like to have forgot. While the whale was running away with the ship, she sprung a leak, and the water poured in so fast that all our pumps could not keep us from sinking. It was, however, my good fortune to discover it first. I found it a large hole about a foot diameter. You will naturally suppose this circumference gives me infinite pleasure when I inform you that this noble vessel was preserved, with all its crew, by a most fortunate thought. In short, I sat down over it, and could have dispensed with it had it been larger, nor will you be surprised when I inform you that I am descended from Dutch parents. My situation, while I sat there, was rather cool, but the carpenter's art soon relieved me. All right, he saved the world with his butt. His head had been pushed in. So imagine the situation. Let me try to paint a picture with words. There's a hole in the ship, and it's probably knee deep in water. Baron Munchausen is sitting with his butt protruding out of a hole of his other ship, and his head has been knocked into his rib cage. Man, they're always trying to arrest me, though, isn't it? It's just something. If it wasn't for how cussedly hot it gets here, I would have definitely been shutting the windows. But, at some point I'll be making a recording booth if I start making enough money to do this. I kind of don't want to see an image of it because I imagine like the the head pushed in, would it be a little goatsy-esque? And I kind of don't want to see that. Chapter 8. Wow. Bathes in the Mediterranean. Meets an unexpected companion. Arrives unintentionally in the regions of heat and darkness from which he is extricated by dancing a hornpipe. Frightens his deliverers and returns on shore. I was once in great danger of being lost in a most singular manner in the Mediterranean. I was bathing in that pleasant sea near Marseille one summer's afternoon when I discovered a very large fish, with his jaws quite extended, approaching me with the greatest velocity. There was no time to be lost, nor could I possibly avoid him. I immediately reduced myself to as small a size as possible by closing my feet and placing my hands also near my sides, in which position I passed directly between his jaws and into his stomach, where I remained some time in total darkness, and comfortably warm, as you may imagine. At last it occurred to me that by giving him pain he would be glad to get rid of me. As I had plenty of room, I played my pranks, such as tumbling, hop, step, and jump, etc., but nothing seemed to disturb him so much as the quick motion of my feet in attempting to dance a hornpipe. Soon after I began, he put me out by sudden fits and starts. I persevered. At last he roared horridly, and stood up almost perpendicularly in the water, with his head and shoulders exposed, by which he was discovered by the people on board an Italian trader, then sailing by, who harpooned him in a few minutes. As soon as he was brought on board, I heard the crew consulting how they should cut him up, so as to preserve the greatest quantity of oil. As I understood Italian, I was in most dreadful apprehensions lest their weapons employed in this business should destroy me also. Therefore I stood as near the center as possible, for there was room enough for 12 men in this creature's stomach, and I naturally imagined they would begin with the extremities. However, my fears were soon dispersed, for they began by opening the bottom of the belly. As soon as I perceived a glimmering of light, I called out lustily to be released from a situation in which I was now almost suffocated. It is impossible for me to do justice to the degree and kind of astonishment which sat upon every countenance at hearing a human voice issue from a fish, but more so at seeing a naked man walk upright out of his body. In short, gentlemen, I told them the whole story, as I have done you, whilst amazement struck them dumb. Well, imagine the shoulders of the fish are the parts, like, just after the neck, right? So you got the head of the fish, then the neck of the fish, and then the shoulders of the fish. This makes sense to me. After taking some refreshment, and jumping into the sea to cleanse myself, I swam to my clothes, which lay where I had left them on the shore. As near as I can calculate, I was near 4 hours and a half confined in the stomach of this animal. Chapter 9. Adventures in Turkey and upon the river Nile. Sees a balloon over Constantinople, shoots at and brings it down. Finds a French experimental philosopher suspended from it. Goes on an embassy to Grand Cairo, and returns upon the Nile, where he is thrown into an unexpected situation and detained 6 weeks. When I was in the service of the Turks, I frequently amused myself in a pleasure barge on the Marmora, which commands a view of the whole city of Constantinople, including the Grand Signor's Seraglio. One morning, as I was admiring the beauty and serenity of the sky, I observed a globular substance in the air, which appeared to be about the size of a 12-inch globe, and was somewhat suspended from it. I immediately took my largest and longest barrel fowling piece, which I never travel or make even an excursion without, if I can help it. I charged with a ball and fired at the globe, but to no purpose, the object being at too great a distance. I then put in a double quantity of powder, and 5 or 6 balls. This second attempt succeeded. All the balls took effect, tore one side open, and brought it down. Judge my surprise when a most elegant gilt car with a man in it, and part of a sheep which seems to have been roasted, fell within 2 yards of me. So what's your reaction when you see something weird in the sky, Montreth? You're just minding your own business, and then something weird floats by. What would you do? Well, I know what this man would do. Shoot it! Shoot it, for heaven's sake. When my astonishment had in some degree subsided, I ordered my people to row close to the strange aerial traveler. All right. Well, you may be onto something there. I wonder then. Maybe we could fashion like some kind of very lightweight looking kind of UFO disguised for a drone. Fly it around, put a little bit of Vaseline on your lens, take a picture of it. TikTok, here we come. Excuse me. I took him on board my barge. He was a native of France. He was much indisposed from his sudden fall into the sea and incapable of speaking. After some time, however, he recovered and gave the following account of himself. About 7 or 8 days since, I cannot tell which, for I have lost my reckoning, having been most of the time where the sun never sets, I ascended from the Land's End in Cornwall, in the island of Great Britain, in the car from which I have been just taken, suspended from a very large balloon, and took a sheep with me to try atmospheric experiments upon. Unfortunately, the wind changed within 10 minutes after my ascent, and instead of driving me towards Exeter, where I intended to land, I was driven towards the sea, over which I suppose I have continued ever since, but much too high to make observations. The calls of hunger were so pressing that the intended experiments upon heat and respiration gave way to them. I was obliged, on the third day, to kill the sheep for food, and being at that time infinitely above the moon, and for upwards of 16 hours after so very near the sun that it scorched my eyebrows, I placed the carcass, taking care to skin it first, in that part of the car where the sun had sufficient power, or in other words, where the balloon did not shade it from the sun, by which method it was well roasted in about 2 hours. This has been my food ever since. Here he paused, and seemed lost in viewing the objects about him. When I told him that the buildings before us were the Grand Seigneur's Seraglio at Constantinople, he seemed exceedingly affected, as he had supposed himself in a very different situation. The cause, added he, of my long flight was owing to the failure of a string which was fixed to a valve in the balloon, intended to let out the inflammable air, and if it had not been fired at and rent in the manner before mentioned, I might, like Mahomet, had been suspended between heaven and earth till doomsday. Hey, he's French. He took it to eat. Come on. God wasn't Welsh. I mean, okay, I'm sorry, Welsh people. You didn't deserve that. The Grand Seigneur, to whom I was introduced by the Imperial Russian and French ambassadors, employed me to negotiate a matter of great importance at Grand Cairo, and which was of such nature that it must ever remain a secret. I went there in great state by land, where, having completed the business, I dismissed almost all my attendants and returned like a private gentleman. The weather was delightful, and that famous river the Nile was beautiful beyond all description. In short, I was tempted to hire a barge to descend by water to Alexandria. On the third day of my voyage, the river began to rise most amazingly. You have all heard, I presume, of the annual overflowing of the Nile. And on the next day it spread the whole country for many leagues on each side. On the fifth, at sunrise, my barge became entangled with what I at first took for shrubs, but as the light became stronger, I found myself surrounded by almonds, which were perfectly ripe and in the highest perfection. Upon plumbing with a line, my people found we were at least 60 feet from the ground, and unable to advance or retreat. At about 8 or 9 o'clock, as near as I could judge by the altitude of the sun, the wind rose suddenly, and canted our barge to one side. Here she filled, and I saw no more of her for some time. Fortunately, we all saved ourselves, 6 men and 2 boys, by clinging to the tree, the boughs of which were equal to our weight, though not to that of the barge. In this situation, we continued 6 weeks and 3 days, living upon the almonds. I need not inform you we had plenty of water. On the 42nd day of our distress, the water fell as rapidly as it had risen, and on the 46th we were able to venture down upon terra firma. Our barge was the first pleasing object we saw, about 200 yards from the spot where she sunk. After drying everything that was useful by the heat of the sun, and loading ourselves with necessaries from the stores on board, we set out to recover our lost ground, and found, by the nearest calculation, we had been carried over garden walls and a variety of enclosures above 150 miles. In 4 days, after a very tiresome journey on foot, with thin shoes, we reached the river, which was now confined to its banks, related our adventures to a boy, who kindly accommodated all our wants, and sent us forward in a barge of his own. In 6 days more we arrived at Alexandria, where we took shipping for Constantinople. I was received kindly by the Grand Signor, and I had the honor of seeing the Seraglio, to which His Highness introduced me himself. Gosh, 6 weeks of and they're not like roasted or I don't think I've ever had a raw almond, because normally they're roasted, aren't they? It's just How are we doing here? Pardon me. Chapter 10. I think I'm just gonna skip these intros because it spoils it a little bit. During the late siege of Gibraltar, I went with a provision fleet under Lord Rodney's command to see my old friend General Elliot, who has, by his distinguished defense of that place, acquired laurels that can never fade. I can't even imagine that. I have to make a point of that at some point, if we can ever. I mean, all right, almonds are so not native to this place. They're very ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. Granted, if we get them from California, I mean, normally they come from California. That comes with, we'll have that conversation a bit later. That's a bit of. I shouldn't have eaten that piece of chocolate. My mouth is just salivating constantly right now. It's very. This would make an unpleasant recording I don't want to go back to. Begging your pardon. After the usual joy which generally attends the meeting of old friends had subsided, I went to examine the state of the garrison and view the operations of the enemy, for which purpose the general accompanied me. I had brought a most excellent refracting telescope with me from London, purchased of Dolland, by the help of which I found the enemy were going to discharge a 36-pounder at the spot where we stood. Oh yeah, I should mention, the missus tried glogi. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And she found it to her liking. It was a bit much for me, though. So, he's going to discharge his 36-pounder. I told the general what they were about. He looked through the glass also and found my conjectures right. I immediately, by his permission, ordered a 48-pounder to be brought from a neighboring battery, which I placed with so much exactness, having long studied the art of gunnery, that I was sure of my mark. I continued watching the enemy till I saw the match placed at the touch-hole of their piece. At that very instant, I gave the signal for our gun to be fired also. About midway between the two pieces of cannon, the balls struck each other with amazing force, and the effect was astonishing. The enemy's ball recoiled back with such violence as to kill the man who had discharged it, by carrying his head fairly off. With 16 others which it met in its progress to the Barbary coast, where its force, after passing through 3 masts of vessels that then lay in a line behind each other in the harbor, was so much spent that it only broke its way through the roof of a poor laborer's hut, about 200 yards inland, and destroyed a few teeth an old woman had left, who lay asleep upon her back with her mouth open. The ball lodged in her throat. Her husband soon after came home and endeavored to extract it, but finding that impractical, by the assistance of a rammer, he forced it into her stomach. Our ball did excellent service, for it not only repelled the other in the manner just described, but, proceeding as I intended it should, it dismounted the very piece of cannon that had just been employed against us, and forced it into the hold of the ship, where it fell with so much force as to break its way through the bottom. The ship immediately filled and sank, with above 1,000 Spanish soldiers on board, besides a considerable number of soldiers. This, to be sure, was a most extraordinary exploit. I will not, however, take the whole merit to myself. My judgment was the principal engine, but chance assisted me a little, for I afterwards found that the man who charged our 48-pounder put in, by mistake, a double quantity of powder. Else we could never have succeeded so much beyond all expectation, especially in repelling the enemy's ball. Well, sometimes you gotta mix it up. Today I shall be patient. General Elliot would have given me a commission for this singular piece of service, but I declined everything, except his thanks, which I received at a crowded table of officers at supper on the evening of that very day. As I am very partial to the English, who are beyond all doubt a brave people, I determined not to take my leave of the garrison till I had rendered them another piece of service, and in about 3 weeks an opportunity presented itself. I dressed myself in the habit of a popish priest, and at about 1 o'clock in the morning stole out of the garrison, past the enemy's lines, and arrived in the middle of their camp, where I entered the tent in which the Prince d'Artois was, with the commander-in-chief and several other officers, in deep council, concerting a plan to storm the garrison next morning. My disguise was my protection. They suffered me to continue there, hearing everything that passed, till they went to their several beds. When I found the whole camp, and even the sentinels, were wrapped up in the arms of Morpheus, I began my work, which was that of dismounting all their cannon, above 300 pieces, from 48 to 24-pounders, and throwing them 3 leagues into the sea. Having no assistance, I found this the hardest task I ever undertook, except swimming to the opposite shore with the famous Turkish piece of ordnance, described by Baron de Tott in his memoirs, which I shall hereafter mention. I then piled all the carriages together in the center of the camp, which, to prevent the noise of the wheels being heard, I carried in pairs under my arms, and a noble appearance they made, as high at least as the rock of Gibraltar. I then lighted a match by striking a flint stone, situated 20 feet from the ground, in an old wall built by the Moors when they invaded Spain, with the breech of an iron 8 and 40-pounder, and so set fire to the whole pile. I forgot to inform you that I threw all their ammunition wagons upon the top. He's got a little bit of strength. I think a 48-pounder weighs, like the cannon for a 48-pounder is something like 7 tons or something like that. So, dude's got some biceps. Before I applied the lighted match, I had laid the combustibles at the bottom so judiciously that the whole was ablaze in a moment. To prevent suspicion, I was the first to express my surprise. The whole camp was, as you may imagine, petrified with astonishment. The general conclusion was that their sentinels had been bribed, and that 7 or 8 regiments of the garrison had been employed in this horrid destruction of their artillery. Mr. Drinkwater, in his account of this famous siege, mentions the enemy sustaining a great loss by a fire which happens in their camp, but never knew the cause. How should he? As I never divulged it before, though I alone saved Gibraltar by this night's business, not even to General Elliot. The Count d'Artois and all his attendants ran away in their fright, and never stopped on the road till they reached Paris, by which they did in about a fortnight. This dreadful conflagration had such an effect upon them that they were incapable of taking the least refreshment for 3 months after, but, chameleon-like, lived upon the air. If any gentleman will say he doubts the truth of the story, I shall find him a gallon of brandy and make him drink it at 1 draught. About 2 months after I had done the besieged this service, one morning, as I sat at breakfast with General Elliot, a shell, for I had not time to destroy their mortars as well as their cannon, entered the apartment we were sitting in. It lodged upon our table. Oh, of course chameleons live just from just air. Don't be silly. He would never lie about this. It lodged upon our table. The general, as most men would do, quitted the room directly, but I took it up before it burst and carried it to the top of the rock, when, looking over the enemy's camp on an eminence near the sea-coast, I observed a considerable number of people, but could not, with my naked eye, discover how they were employed. I had recourse again to my telescope, when I found that 2 of our officers, one a general, the other a colonel, with whom I had spent the preceding evening, and who went out into the enemy's camp at about midnight as spies, were taken, and then were actually going to be executed on a gibbet. I found the distance too great to throw the shell with my hand, but most fortunately recollecting that I had the very sling in my pocket which assisted David in slaying Goliath, I placed the shell in it, and immediately threw it into the midst of them. It burst as it fell, and destroyed all present, except the 2 culprits, who were saved by being suspended so high, for they were just turned off. However, one of the pieces of the shell fled with such great force against the foot of the gibbet that it immediately brought it down. Our 2 friends no sooner felt terra firma than they looked about for the cause, and finding their guards, executioner and all, had taken it in their heads to die first, they directly extricated each other from their disgraceful cords, and then ran down to the seashore, seized the Spanish boat with 2 men in it, and made them row to one of our ships, which they did with great safety. And in a few minutes after, when I was relating to General Elliot how I had acted, they took us both by the hand, and after mutual congratulations, we retired to spend the day with festivity. That was actually better than, and then everybody stood and applauded. Chapter 11. You wish, I can see by your countenances, I would inform you how I became possessed of such a treasure as the sling just mentioned. Here facts must be held sacred. Thus, then it was. I am a descendant of the wife of Uriah, whom we all know David was intimate with. She had several children by his majesty. They quarreled once upon a matter of the first consequence, the spot where Noah's ark was built, and where it rested after the flood. A separation consequently ensued. She had often heard him speak of this sling as his most valuable treasure. This she stole the night they parted. It was missed before she got out of his dominions, and she was pursued by no less than 6 of the king's bodyguards. However, by using it herself, she hit the first of them, for one was more active in the pursuit than the rest, where David did Goliath, and killed him on the spot. Oh yeah, it was literally David's sling. for real and honest. His companions were so alarmed at his fall that they retired, and left Uriah's wife to pursue her journey. She took with her, I should have informed you before, her favorite son by this connection, to whom she bequeathed the sling, and thus it has, without interruption, descended from father to son, till it came into my possession. One of its possessors, my great-great-great-grandfather, who lived about 250 years ago, was upon a visit to England, and became intimate with a poet who was a great deer stealer. I think his name was Shakespeare? He frequently borrowed this sling, and with it killed so much of Sir Thomas Lucy's venison that he narrowly escaped the fate of my 2 friends at Gibraltar. Poor Shakespeare was imprisoned, and my ancestor obtained his freedom in a very singular manner. Queen Elizabeth was then on the throne, but grown so indolent that every trifling matter was a trouble to her, dressing, undressing, eating, drinking, and some other offices which shall be nameless, made life a burden to her. All these things he enabled her to do without, or by a deputy. And what do you think was the only return she could prevail upon him to accept for such eminent services? Setting Shakespeare at liberty. Such was his affection for that famous writer that he would have shortened his own days to add to the number of his friends. I do not hear that any of the Queen's subjects, particularly the beef-eaters, as they are vulgarly called to this day, however they might be struck with the novelty at the time, much approved of her living totally without food. She did not survive the practice herself above 7 1/2. My father, who was the immediate possessor of this sling before me, told me the following anecdote. He was walking by the seashore at Harwich, with his sling in his pocket. Before his paces had covered a mile, he was attacked by a fierce animal called a seahorse, open-mouthed, who ran at him with a great fury. He hesitated for a moment, then took out his sling, retreated back about 100 yards, stooped for a couple of pebbles, of which there were plenty under his feet, and slung them both so dexterously at the animal that each stone put out an eye, and lodged in the cavities which their removal had occasioned. Hey now, don't accuse him of lying. Seahorses are psycho, clearly. He now got upon his back and drove him into the sea. For the moment he had lost his sight, he also lost ferocity, and became as tame as possible. The sling was placed as a bridle in his mouth. He was guided with the greatest facility across the ocean, and in less than 3 hours they both arrived on the opposite shore, which is about 30 leagues. The master of the 3 Cups at Helvoetsluis in Holland purchased this marine horse to make an exhibition of for 700 ducats, which was upwards of 300 pounds, and the next day my father paid his passage back in the packet to Harwich. My father made several curious observations in this passage, which I will relate hereafter. Chapter 12. The Frolic. This famous sling makes the possessor equal to any task he is desirous of performing. I made a balloon of such extensive dimensions that an account of the silk it contained would exceed all credibility. Every mercer's shop and weaver's stock in London, Westminster, and Spitalfields contributed to it. With this balloon and my sling I played many tricks, such as taking one house from its station and placing another in its stead, without disturbing the inhabitants, who were generally asleep, or too much employed to observe the peregrinations of their habitations. When the sentinel at Windsor Castle heard St. Paul's clock strike 13, it was through my dexterity. I brought the buildings nearly together that night by placing the castle in St. George's Fields, and carried it back again before daylight without waking any of the inhabitants. Notwithstanding these exploits, I should have kept my balloon and its properties a secret, if Montgolfier had not made the art of flying so public. As a little point of trivia, Montgolfier was a French inventor of balloons, and his name is what they call balloons. So in English it's balloons, in French it's Montgolfier. So, hooray. Culture! Yeah, right? So, not like anybody who's seen this giant-ass thing floating in the air carrying houses or something. I don't know. On the 30th of September, when the College of Physicians chose their annual officers and dined sumptuously together, I filled my balloon, brought it over the dome of their building, clapped the sling around the golden ball at the top, fastening the other end of it to the balloon, and immediately ascended with the whole college to an immense height, where I kept them upwards of 3 months. You will naturally inquire what they did for food such a length of time? To this answer, had I kept them suspended twice the time, they would have experienced no inconvenience on that account. So amply, or rather extravagantly, had they spread their table for that day's feasting. Though this was meant as an innocent frolic, it was productive of much mischief to several respectable characters amongst the clergy, undertakers, sextons, and gravediggers. They were, it must be acknowledged, sufferers, for it is a well-known fact that during the 3 months the college was suspended in the air, and therefore incapable of attending their patients, no deaths happened, except a few who fell before the scythe of Father Time, and some melancholy objects who, perhaps to avoid some trifling inconvenience here, laid the hands of violence upon themselves, and plunged into misery infinitely greater than that which they hoped by such a rash step to avoid, without a moment's consideration. Yeah, I don't have a good anecdote. We didn't, but that must be kind of nice, actually. Also, I just remember that your father's industry is a lot of smoked fish, and for which I'm eternally jealous. If the apothecaries had not been very active during the above time, half the undertakers in all probability would have been bankrupt. Chapter 13. A Trip to the North. This involves some bears again. We all remember actually, now I'm just like, I want to go and get some smoked salmon. I'm jealous. Shouldn't have thought about that. It'll be a trip for tomorrow if I get all my work done on time. We all remember Captain Phipps, now Lord Mulgrave, last journey of discovery to the north. I accompanied the captain, not as an officer, but as a private friend. When we arrived in a high northern latitude, I was viewing the objects around me with a telescope, which I introduced to your notice in my Gibraltar adventures. I thought I saw 2 large white bears in violent action upon a body of ice considerably above the masts, about half a league distance. Well, you and I both shall suffer for want of smoked fish, but we'll resolve that tomorrow. I immediately took my carbine, slung it across my shoulder, and ascended the ice. When I arrived at the top, the unevenness of the surface made my approach to these animals troublesome and hazardous beyond expression. Sometimes hideous cavities opposed me, which I was obliged to spring over, and in other parts the surface was as smooth as a mirror, and I was continually falling. As I approached near enough to reach them, I found they were only at play. I immediately began to calculate the value of their skins, for they're each as large as a well-fed ox. Unfortunately, at the very instant I was presenting my carbine, my right foot slipped. I fell upon my back, and the violence of the blow deprived me totally of my senses for nearly half an hour. However, when I recovered, judge of my surprise at finding one of these large animals I had just describing had turned me upon my face, and it was just laying hold of the waistband of my breeches, which were, oh dear, I don't think I like where that's going, which were then new and made of leather. He was certainly going to carry me off feet foremost. God knows where, when I took this knife, showing a large clasp knife, out of my side pocket, made a chop at one of his hind feet, and cut off 3 of his toes. He immediately let me drop and roared most horribly. I took up my carbine and fired at him as he ran off. He fell directly. The noise of the piece roused several thousand of these white bears, who were asleep upon the ice within half a mile of me. They came immediately to the spot. There was no time to be lost. A most fortunate thought arrived in my pericranium just at that moment. I took off the skin and head of the dead bear, and half the time that some people would be in skinning a rabbit, and wrapped myself in it, placing my own head directly under the Bruins. The whole herd came round me immediately, and my apprehensions threw me into a most piteous situation, to be sure. However, my scheme turned out to be a most admirable one for my own safety. They all came smelling, and evidently took me for a brother Bruin. I wanted nothing but bulk to make an excellent counterfeit. However, I saw several cubs amongst them not much larger than myself. After they had all smelt me, and the body of their deceased companion, whose skin was now become my protector, we seemed very sociable, and I found I could mimic all their actions tolerably well. But at growling, roaring, and hugging, they were quite my masters. I began now to think that I might turn the general confidence which I had created amongst these animals to my advantage. I had heard an old army surgeon say a wound in the spine was instant death. I now determined to try the experiment, and had again recourse to a knife, with which I stuck the largest in the back of the neck, near the shoulders, but under great apprehensions, not doubting but the creature would, if he survived the stab, tear me to pieces. However, I was remarkably fortunate, for he fell dead at my feet without making the least noise. I was now resolved to demolish them every one in the same manner, which I accomplished without the least difficulty, for although they saw their companions fall, they had no suspicion of either the cause or the effect. When they all lay dead before me, I felt myself a second Samson, having slain my thousands. Yeah, this guy killed all the polar bears. He's a jerk. To make short of the story, I went back to the ship and borrowed 3 parts of the crew to assist me in skinning them and carrying the hams on board, which we did in a few hours and loaded the ship with them. As to the other parts of the animals, they were thrown into the sea, though I doubt not but the whole would eat as well as the legs, were they properly cured. As soon as we returned, I sent some of the hams, in the captain's name, to the lords of the Admiralty, others to the lords of the Treasury, some to the Lord Mayor and Corporation of London, a few to each of the trading companies, and the remainder to my particular friends, from all of whom I received warm thanks. But from the city I was honored with substantial notice, an invitation to dine at Guildhall annually on Lord Mayor's Day. I can tell you that bear meat is actually pretty awful to eat. The bear skins I sent to the Empress of Russia, to clothe her majesty and her court in the winter, for which she wrote me a letter of thanks with her own hand, and sent it by an ambassador extraordinary, inviting me to share the honors of her crown. But as I never was ambitious of royal dignity, I declined her majesty's favor in the politest terms. The same ambassadors had orders to wait and bring my answer to her majesty personally, upon which business he was absent about 3 months. Her majesty's reply convinced me of the strength of her affections and the dignity of her mind. Her late indisposition was entirely owing, as she, kind creature, was pleased to express herself in a late conversation with the Prince Dolgoruki, to my cruelty. What the sex see in me I cannot conceive, but the Empress is not the only female sovereign who has offered me her hand. Eyebrow waggle. Some people have very illiberally reported that Captain Phipps did not proceed as far as he might have done in that expedition. Here it becomes my duty to acquit him. Our ship was in a very proper trim till I loaded it with such an immense quantity of bearskins and hams, after which it would have been madness to have attempted to proceed farther, as we were now scarcely able to combat a brisk gale, much less those mountains of ice which lay in the higher altitudes. The captain has since often expressed a dissatisfaction that he had no share in the honors of that day, which he emphatically called Bearskin Day. He has also been very desirous of knowing by what art I destroyed so many thousands, without fatigue or danger to myself. Indeed, he is so ambitious of dividing the glory with me that we have actually quarreled over it, and we are not now upon speaking terms. He boldly asserts that I had no merit in deceiving the bears, because I was covered with one of their skins. Nay, he declares there is not, in his opinion, in Europe, so complete a bear naturally as himself among the human species. He is now a noble peer, and I am too well acquainted with good manners to dispute so delicate a point with his lordship. Yeah, you got it exactly. Oh, a modest man like me would never dare to presume to hobnob with royalty. No. But, yeah, but they want what I got, if you know what I mean. And you know what I mean. Chapter 14. Baron de Tott, in his memoirs, makes as great a parade of a single act as many travelers whose whole lives had been spent in seeing the different parts of the globe. For my part, if I had been blown from Europe to Asia from the mouth of a cannon, I should have boasted less of it afterwards than he has done of only firing off a Turkish piece of ordnance. What he says of this wonderful gun, as near as my memory will serve me, is this. The Turks had placed below the castle and near the city, on the banks of the Simois, a celebrated river, an enormous piece of ordnance cast in brass, which would carry a marble ball of 1,100 pounds weight. I was inclined, says Tott, to fire it, but I was willing first to judge of its effects. The crowd about me trembled at this proposal, as they asserted it would overthrow not only the castle, but the city also. At last their fears in part subsided, and I was permitted to discharge it. It required not less than 330 pounds weight of powder, and the ball weighed, as before mentioned, 1,100 weight. Excuse me. When the engineer brought the priming, the crowds who were about me retreated back as fast as they could. Nay, it was with the utmost difficulty I persuaded the Pacha, who came on purpose. There was no danger. Even the engineer who was to discharge it by my direction was considerably alarmed. I took my stand on some stonework behind the cannon, gave the signal, and felt a shock like that of an earthquake. At the distance of 300 fathom, the ball burst into 3 pieces. The fragments crossed the strait, rebounded on the opposite mountain, and left the surface of the water all in a foam through the whole breadth of the channel. This, gentlemen, is, as near as I can recollect, Baron Tott's account of the largest cannon in the known world. Now, when I was there not long since, the anecdote of Tott's firing this tremendous piece was mentioned as a proof of that gentleman's extraordinary courage. I was determined not to be outdone by a Frenchman, therefore took this very piece upon my shoulder, and after balancing it properly, jumped into the sea with it, and swam to the opposite shore, from whence I unfortunately attempted to throw it back into its former place. I say unfortunately, for it slipped a little in my hand just as I was about to discharge it, and in consequence of that, it fell into the middle of the channel, where it now lies, without a prospect of ever recovering it. And notwithstanding the high favor I was in with the Grand Seigneur, as mentioned before, this cruel Turk, as soon as he heard the loss of his famous piece of ordnance, issued an order to cut off my head. I was immediately informed of it by one of the sultanas, with whom I was become a great favorite, and she secreted me in her apartment, while the officer charged with my execution was, with his assistance, in search of me. That very night, I made my escape on board a vessel bound to Venice, which was then weighing anchor to proceed on her voyage. The last story, gentlemen, I am not fond of mentioning, as I miscarried in the attempt, and was very near losing my life into the bargain. However, as it contains no impeachment of my honor, I would not withhold it from you. Now, gentlemen, you all know me, and can have no doubt of my veracity. I will entertain you with the origin of this same swaggering, bouncing Tott. Everybody, and those who hate those who love him a lot, and those who hate him are simply jelly. Clearly, his reputed father was a native of Bern, in Switzerland. His profession was that of a surveyor of the streets, lanes, and alleyways, vulgarly called a scavenger. His mother was a native of the mountains of Savoy, and had a most beautiful large wen on her neck, common to both sexes in that part of the world. She left her parents when young, and sought her fortune in the same city which gave his father birth. She maintained herself, while single, by acts of kindness to our sex. She was never known to refuse them any favor they asked, provided they did but pay her some compliment beforehand. This lovely couple met by accident in the streets, in consequence of their being both intoxicated, for by reeling to one center they threw each other down. This created mutual abuse, in which they were complete adepts. They were both carried to the watch-house, and afterwards to the house of correction. They soon saw the folly of quarreling, made it up, became fond of each other, and married, but Madame returning to her old tricks, his father, who had high notions of honor, soon separated himself from her. She then joined a family who strolled about with a puppet show. In time she arrived at Rome, where she kept an oyster stand. You have all heard, no doubt, of Pope Ganganelli, commonly called Clement XIV. He was remarkably fond of oysters. One Good Friday, as he was passing through this famous city and state to assist at High Mass at St. Peter's Church, he saw this woman's oysters, which were remarkably fine and fresh. He could not proceed without tasting them. There were about 5,000 people in his train. He ordered them all to stop, and sent word to the church that he could not attend Mass till next day. Then, alighting from his horse, for the Pope always rides on horseback upon these occasions, he went into her stall and ate every oyster she had there, and afterwards retired into the cellar, where she had a few more. This subterraneous apartment was her kitchen, parlor, and bedchamber. He liked his situation so much that he discharged all his attendants, and to make short of the story, His Holiness passed the whole night there. Before they parted, he gave her absolution, not only for every sin she had, but all she might hereafter commit. Now, gentlemen, I have his mother's word for it, and her honor cannot be doubted, that Baron Tott is the fruit of that amour. When Tott was born, his mother applied to His Holiness as the father of her child. He immediately placed him under the proper people, and as he grew up gave him a gentleman's education, had him taught of the use of arms, procured him promotion in France and a title, and when he died left him a good estate. So, not that I don't like the guy or nothing, but he's the son of a slut and a cheating pope. Nah. What a man of dignity. All right, I think we have time for another one. Well, those papists and their dispensations, I think they were called. I forgot the term. You could actually buy forgiveness, at least back in the time. That's sort of what gave rise to the whole Protestant thing. But chapter 15. I omitted several very material parts in my father's journey across the English Channel to Holland, which, that they may not be totally lost, I will now faithfully give you in his own words, as I have heard him relate them to his friends several times. Upon my arrival, says my father, at Helvoetsluys, I was observed to breathe with some difficulty. Upon the inhabitants inquiring into the cause, I informed them that the animal upon whose back I rode from Harwich across to the shore did not swim. Such is their peculiar form and disposition that they cannot float or move upon the surface of the water. He ran with incredible swiftness upon the sands from the shore, driving fish in millions before him, many of which were quite different from any I had yet seen, carrying their heads at the extremities of their tails. I crossed, continued he, one prodigious range of rocks, equal in height to the Alps. The tops or highest parts of these marine mountains are said to be upwards of 100 fathoms below the surface of the sea, on the sides of which was a great variety of tall, noble trees, loaded with marine fruit, such as lobsters, crabs, oysters, scallops, mussels, cockles, etc., etc., some of which were a cartload singly, and none the less than a porter's. All those which are brought on shore and sold in our markets are of an inferior dwarf kind, or properly, waterfalls, i.e., fruit shook off the branches of the tree it grows upon by the motion of the water, as those in our gardens are by that of the wind. The lobster trees appeared the richest, but the crabs and oysters were the tallest. The periwinkle is a kind of shrub. It grows at the foot of the oyster tree, and twines round it as the ivy does the oak. I observed the effect of several accidents by shipwreck, etc., particularly a ship that had been wrecked by striking against a mountain or rock, the top of which lay within 3 fathoms of the surface. As she sank, she fell upon her side and forced a very large lobster tree out of its place. It was in the spring, when the lobsters were very young, and many of them being separated by the violence of the shock, they fell upon a crab tree which was growing below them. They have, like the farina of plants, united, and produced a fish resembling both. I endeavored to bring one with me, but it was too cumbersome, and my saltwater Pegasus seemed much displeased at every attempt to stop his career whilst I continued upon his back. Besides, I was then, though galloping over a mountain of rocks that lay about midway the passage, at least 500 fathoms below the surface of the sea, and began to find the want of air inconvenient. Therefore, I had no inclination to prolong the time. Add to this, my situation was in other respects very unpleasant. I met many large fish, who were, if I could judge them by their open mouths, not only able, but really wished to devour us. Now, as my Rosinette was blind, I had these hungry gentlemen's attempts to guard against, in addition to my other difficulties. Yeah, you ever had an unripe lobster? They're really not very nice. They need some time to age, As we drew near the Dutch shore, and the body of water over our heads did not exceed 20 fathoms, I thought I saw a human figure in a female dress then lying on the sand before me with some signs of life. When I came close, I perceived her hand move. I took it into mine, and brought her on shore as a corpse. An apothecary, who had just been instructed by Dr. Hawes — the Baron's father must have lived very lately if Dr. Hawes was his preceptor — of London, treated her properly, and she recovered. She was the rib of a man who commanded a vessel belonging to Helvoetsluys. He was just going out of a port on a voyage when she, hearing he had got a mistress with him, followed him in an open boat. As soon as she had got on the quarter-deck, she flew at her husband, and attempted to strike him with such impetuosity that he thought it most prudent to slip on one side, and let her make the impression of her fingers upon the waves rather than his face. He was not much out in his ideas of the consequence, for meeting no opposition, she went directly overboard, and it was my unfortunate lot to lay the foundation for bringing this happy pair together again. I can easily conceive what execrations the husband loaded me with when, on his return, he found this gentle creature waiting his arrival, and learned the means by which she came into the world again. However, great as the injury is which I have done this poor devil, I hope he will die in charity with me, as my motive was good, though the consequences to him it must be confessed, horrible. All right. Let's do one more and we'll call it. Just a short one. Chapter 16. This is a very short chapter, but contains a fact for which the Baron's memory ought to be dear to every Englishman, especially those who hereafter may have the misfortune of being made prisoners of war. On my return from Gibraltar, I travelled by way of France to England. Being a foreigner, this was not attended with any inconvenience to me. I found, in the harbour of Calais, a ship just arrived with a number of English sailors as prisoners of war. I immediately conceived an idea of giving these brave fellows their liberty, which I accomplished as follows. After forming a large pair of wings, each of them 40 yards long and 14 wide, and annexing them to myself, I mounted at break of day, when every creature, even the watch upon deck, was fast asleep. As I hovered over the ship, I fastened 3 grappling irons to the tops of the 3 masts with my sling, and fairly lifted her several yards out of the water, and then proceeded across to Dover, where I arrived in half an hour. Having no further occasion for these wings, I made them a present to the governor of Dover Castle, where they are now exhibited to the curious. As to the prisoners, and the Frenchmen who guarded them, they did not wake till they had been near 2 hours on Dover Pier. The moment the English understood their situation, they changed places with their guard, and took back what they had been plundered of. But no more, for they were too generous to retaliate and plunder them in return. So don't worry, lads. Baron Munchausen will fly in and rescue you if you get captured. It's a good note to end on, though. So don't fear being taken prisoner. It'll be okay. You know, thanks for showing up, though. Honestly, I really do like having this conversation as I'm reading, and I realize anybody listening to this is going to find it a little bit discordant, but what are you going to do? Gosh, I'm just racking my brains of thought. I'm just also a little bit daunted because holy crap, have I got a lot of work to do today. You will definitely hear more in the future. Same bat time, same bat channel, every Sunday, we'll tackle it then. Imagine it must be time for you to go to sleep, and it's time for me to tackle a bunch of work. So let me hit the stop button shortly, and let me bid you a good evening.